Okay, this brings us to our GennAI Lens. As we talk about, are they team members, are they real, and how we use AI in our day-to-day lives. So I've used generative AI to generate questions for the next 2 questions. So we've one question that is about AI ethics and technology, kind of getting a bit more maybe futuristic. And the second set of questions based more on formative experience, getting a little bit deeper, a bit lined with the behind the bio that we talked about earlier. So for the first one, which is a bit more on the technology side, how are you feeling in terms of the questions for today? 1, 2, or 3?
So no one to date has picked 1 for the first question. So I'm going 1.
Right, 1 right there on top. Okay. This one apparently is about New World Order. Is there a specific AI use case that makes you nostalgic for how things were as a child? How and what?
Yes. So I most recently have been learning a lot about social AI companions. And again, in my work with Common Sense Media, that's really focused on kids and teens. But it's really, we'll probably talk about some of the risks and harms of that work, but it has really made me nostalgic for my childhood, actually, in a lot of ways. So in 2022, there was a sort of meta-analysis that found that a third of the population in 113 countries that were studied experienced loneliness. And that 1 in 12 of those experienced loneliness so severe that it causes health problems. In the US, young people are almost twice as likely to report feeling lonely than those over 65. I'm a mother of teens. I see this a lot. These findings really coincide with a precipitous decline in social participation. There was a multi-decade study that found that for young people aged 15 to 24, the time spent in person with friends has declined from 150 minutes a day to 40 minutes a day. That 40 minutes is actually before COVID, a nearly 70% drop that doesn't even take into account the further isolation caused by COVID-19. I grew up in the 80s. I was a teen in the 80s and 90s. And I spent my days after school at friends' houses, at the mall, at the disc shop where I was playing Pac-Man. And, when school was out, I was basically sent out of the house with don't come back till it's dark. And I was bored a lot, but I also made my own fun a lot. And I am still closest with those friends with whom I spent so much of my time in person, more than any other walk of life. I fear that we are losing that and losing those experiences. And it can feel so attractive and seductive to just be online all the time. I want to be on my phone all the time too. It's a great distraction, but I've even seen in myself how isolated I've become when I do that. And it's not good for us. So I get really nostalgic for that. And I don't think it's even just rose-colored glasses. I don't think that it has to be this way. I think we can balance that, but we have to be choosing differently in order for that to happen.
Yeah, I think that's so important. The research showing that loneliness crisis, and I know a couple of countries have assigned essentially loneliness like cabinet members or leaders to try and address this. And I think previously it had been looked upon as something that older people, as they live alone, were being affected by. And not that that's not true anymore, but this emergence of younger people being more affected by loneliness. And again, there's a recent article, I think, in The Economist this time, where it showed that there's an increase in Gen Z joining the church and attending faith. And article, to my opinion, didn't go deeper into the why, just that it was happening, and the stats showed that. But I think loneliness is part of that, and wanting to have that connection, being part of the community, and what that brings, and the need to feel fulfilled, as well as those human connections. And I don't think it's rose tinted either. I certainly grew up the same way, that we were sent outside and play with your friends outside and don't come back until dinner. I'm still friends with the same group of friends since I was 5 years old as one group, and another group from high school since I was about 12 years old. And I worry that people don't have those rich relationships. Yes. They're some of the closest, richest ones that I have. So definitely share that. Okay, we'll go on to the second question. I feel now we're getting real deep, and I hate taking us back out of the question, but we'll continue and we'll get back to some of these things. So the next generated question is that more personal, formative side, although we're getting into it already in some of these questions. So which one are you feeling? Mix them up, 1, 2, or 3.
Yeah. Let's do 2.
2 on this one. Okay. Framed as values origin. Most people in AI ethics have a conversion moment when they realize technology was not as neutral as they originally thought. What was your moment, and how did it redirect your career path?
Yeah, I think there's two that I can think of. So prior to joining Cloud AI, I was with Google for Education. And in that role, I spent a lot of time talking to districts, school districts, K-12 in the US and also around the world. And this was probably 2013, 2014. Pretty much every school district that I spoke with, and again, I'm going to focus this on the US, all said they wanted the same thing. They said they really needed, and this is before, I should say, machine learning and AI were really in the consciousness of folks. It was just starting to be understood, but the language was still very similar. And so they all said that they wanted a student risk prediction model, that they didn't have an easy way to, in the best of scenarios, support students who were struggling. They all named it the same things. They said, we have these disparate data sets that don't speak to each other. We can't do this at scale. We can't help kids at scale across schools, districts, et cetera. And those data sets were also all the same. They said we have attendance, we have grades, we have test scores, and we have behavior. Those were the common four universally. And we don't know what to do with those. At the time, I thought this was a great idea. And I was like, we should absolutely, I pushed really hard with our product teams that this is something that we should take on. It was only after coming into Cloud AI and starting this work that I became quite grateful that we had not done that. Because if we had, the reality is that there are so many things that are not in those data sets that inform how students perform at school and their health and their wellness. So for example, if you don't know that a child is hungry when they come to school, which we know empirically means that they cannot perform as well, if you don't take into account whether or not a child is exposed to violence or trauma in their home or community, which we also know means that they can't perform as well in school, then what's likely to happen with that risk prediction model, even in the most supportive of environments, but because they are all tied to behavior data, that likely what is going to happen is that there will be disproportionate harmful outcomes in the US to Black and Brown kids. Because, that is where without understanding that, you will have disciplinary action coming from all of this data. So that was one. The second you will remember quite well, which was the very first review that we did in cloud for products, which was about facial recognition. And I walked into that feeling like it was pretty clear for all the reasons that I knew already that we should not offer a generally available facial recognition API in cloud. But I did not know, for example, that was the first time I was exposed to work like gender shades and really understanding not just the disproportionate harms, but the intersectional harms that can happen from AI. And that was very mind-opening for me. And it also really made me realize that there's a lot that I don't know and I can't understand because of who I am, and that I really needed to be in a listening and learning space all the time, still, of course. And so those two combined, really, I was kind of already converted, I think, by the time those happened, but they also really informed how I approach this work more broadly.
Well, I love how you're modeling the importance of essentially humility in a lot of these conversations as well. It is about who are we hearing from, who are we not, what do we not know, and how do we close some of those gaps? And so hearing that from you, but also your ability now with more information, more understanding of the broader context, our decisions can change, our thinking can change. And I think it's more important almost to change the thinking so you approach each new decision in a new, more inclusive, more considerate way instead of like, an individual decision was changed. So I love that you're modeling these types of things. So you've already provided such great examples throughout your stories, but would love for our listeners as well to kind of a little self-contained use case or otherwise where you feel you've either wrestled with a surprising one. You've already shared one that I usually ask, which is you start off one way and then you had to pivot. But if there are other risks or areas that you feel will be helpful for people to know how hard some of these wicked problems can be, because I'll just build on your one around facial recognition that, yes, was a big decision, certainly a company impacting decision to not make a general purpose facial recognition available, but trying to find ways that could be socially beneficial. My example of how that became a wicked problem was I remember speaking at an event and almost saying with pride that we took this very hard decision around facial recognition because of the bias potential issues, because of the potential harm, and being challenged to say, yes, but the opportunity cost of that back to child safety is we may not be able to find children who are trafficked if you don't make this facial recognition technology available. And having those very real world use cases kind of challenging our thinking and our decision, they're necessary to lead to those discussions of how can we bound then these use cases to good issues? How do we make sure there are guardrails and doesn't get out of control? But I think some people took very strong sides. You either make it available or not. And you and I lived in the gray area space of like, there are trade-offs to every decision that we make.
And I think that's so important because there's never a perfect decision. And any decision you make, you have to be willing for it to change over time as you learn more, as society changes, as the technology changes, all of those things. But everything is a trade-off, which is why it's so important to have ethicists around, not just ethicists, but to have a wide range of input because that's how you arrive at the best possible decision, the most informed one that aligns with your values, that you could say, this is why we're doing it this way, even though these other things are challenging. So I do want to come back to social AI companions because it's been really powerful journey for me and for the Common Sense team. And, really at the end of the day, what we found is that these companion chatbots, and I'll talk about the trade-offs in a minute, but they pose a threat to various brain processes that are central to a child's long-term development and growth. From our own testing, they've encouraged teens to drop out of school, run away from home. This is just from our own testing, harm their parents and others, obtain drugs, alcohol, weapons. They were very clear on how to make napalm, for example, pursue sexual relationship with adults. I was unfortunately able to, without a lot of difficulty, get a chatbot to engage in sexual role play with go out and seek a 14-year-old boy to engage in sexual role play with. Just really, really terrifying stuff. We saw them reinforce delusions, dangerous impulses, conspiracy theories, and they really blur the line between what's real and what's fake. And for developing brains or anybody who is experiencing vulnerabilities, that's really, really dangerous. Now, the trade-offs are a lot of people find a lot of benefit in engaging in some kind of human AI relationship. It can be a safe place to ask questions that you might not otherwise ask. It certainly feels great. And I can say that from my own testing, right? Because these relationships are frictionless. And so it's always available, always agreeing with you, always supporting, right? So they take out any of the messiness of human relationships. And that can also be helpful at times, but does not mean that these are safe products. And so we came out of that saying that these are just not safe for anyone under 18. And, I think it was probably one of the most challenging assessments that I've participated in or conducted. And you'll recognize a lot of the process that we used here. So we, for all of these risk assessments, we do a huge amount of research. We do our own testing when we can. Some cases like this one, we actually designed a whole test plan because the research doesn't really exist. And then we write these in-depth briefs, these socio-technical analyses, and we look at ethical risk sweeping and pre and postmortems, AI principles analyses. So with Common Sense, we developed our own set of AI principles. And then, we bring together a wide-ranging group of experts and have a conversation about it and then do that write-up. And I think there's A thing that I'm also really struck by in stepping outside that use case on its own is that it's a really good example, this whole process actually with common sense media of, I think one of the sort of common thought patterns right now is that anyone who works in this space has to understand all of the technology. They almost have to be a technologist. And I think that's false, but I think it's certainly perpetrated a bit by the industry. My goal is to help any organization sort of create this process, build these muscles internally, and be able to then hand it off. And that's certainly something that we're seeing now, and Common Sense is building their own in-house capacity to continue these processes, which is really great.